The snow did not fall so much as it seeped from a sky the color of a fresh bruise. It was a mean, wet snow that clung to everything, turning the hard-packed mud of the town's main street into a treacherous, ankle-deep slurry. It found the bare skin of the children huddled against the wall of the general store and clung there like a promise of the grave. There were 8 of them, packed together for a warmth that was mostly memory. They were a staircase of misery, from a boy who looked to be 5 to a girl who could have been 16 or 60. She was the one who held them together, a fierce, silent anchor in their small sea of despair. Her arms were wrapped around the 2 smallest, and the others pressed into her back and sides, a single shivering organism with many eyes. All of their heads were bare, shaved close to the scalp, a stark, uniform nakedness that spoke of institution, of sickness, of being scrubbed clean of identity. The raw, pink skin of their scalps looked impossibly fragile under the weeping gray sky. Townsfolk passed, their collars pulled high, their boots making sucking sounds in the mud. They were ghosts in heavy coats. Some glanced and quickly looked away, a flicker of shame or annoyance in their eyes. A woman in a fine wool shawl dropped a coin that vanished into the brown slush, a gesture more for her own soul than for theirs. The children did not move to find it. They only watched, their faces pinched and old, their eyes holding a stillness that was unnerving. They did not beg with their voices or their hands, but with their very existence. They were a question nobody wanted to answer. The eldest girl kept her gaze fixed on the middle distance, just above the heads of the people who refused to see her. Her face was a mask of pale resignation, beautiful in the way a frozen river is beautiful, all sharp angles and captured light, with a dangerous depth beneath. Her hands, tucked under the arms of the little ones, were cracked and blue with cold. She had forgotten the feeling of warmth. It was a story told in another language. Then, a man stopped. He did not stop like the others, with a hesitant pause or a guilty glance. He stopped fully, his worn leather boots planting themselves in the mud a few feet away from the huddle. He was not a man of this town. He was carved from the land itself, from the wind-scoured plains and the hard rock hills. His coat was long and frayed, the color of dust, and his hat was pulled low, casting his face in a deep shadow. He stood there for a long moment, a monolith against the swirling snow. He was not looking at them as a group. His eyes, when he finally lifted his head enough for the weak light to catch them, were fixed on the eldest girl. They were eyes that had seen things burn down to ash. They carried whole winters in them. He saw the way she held the smaller children, the rigid line of her spine, the defiant emptiness in her gaze. He saw a fence post holding against a blizzard, and he knew the cost of standing alone. The murmurs of the town died on the wind. The few people still on the street slowed their pace, watching. This was something different. This was not charity. Felt like a reckoning. The man Silas took a slow step forward. The children flinched as a single body. The eldest girl's chin lifted a fraction of an inch, the only sign of her fear. He saw it. He stopped again. He moved with a deliberation that was almost painful to watch, as if every motion cost him something. He did not reach for a coin. He did not offer a word of pity. He simply sank to one knee in the freezing mud, the fabric of his trousers darkening immediately with the wet. He brought himself down to their level, an act of such profound respect it fractured the cold air. The shadow left his face, and they saw the lines etched there, a map of grief and solitude. Section he looked at the eldest girl, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together under a river. It was a voice that sounded like it came from under floorboards. "You're safe with me now." It was not a question. It was a statement, as solid and real as the frozen ground beneath them. He held out a hand, not to touch them, but with the palm open, an offering of space. The girl stared at his hand. It was large, calloused, the knuckle scarred. It was a hand that knew work and sorrow. For a long second, the world held its breath. The snow fell, the wind whispered its mean secrets, and the town watched, a gallery of ghosts. Then, slowly, as if moving a limb that had long been asleep, She untangled herself from the smallest child and placed her own icy hand in his. It was not a surrender. It was an agreement, a treaty signed in the heart of a storm. Silas's fingers closed gently around hers, a fleeting warmth in the vast, unending cold. He rose, pulling her carefully to her feet. The other children, watching her, their leader, their sun and moon, untangled themselves and scrambled up, their eyes wide and fixed on the tall, quiet man. He led them away from the wall, away from the hollow-eyed town, his large frame shielding them from the wind. The dust-colored coat became their moving wall, their sanctuary. The journey was a long, silent procession through a world bleached of color. Silas had a wagon hitched near the edge of town, a sturdy, plain thing with a tired-looking horse that seemed to share its owner's disposition. He lifted the smallest children into the back, his movements economical and sure. The others scrambled up after them, their bare feet leaving damp prints on the weathered wood. The eldest girl climbed in last, seating herself at the very back, her spine straight, her eyes on the town as it receded behind them. Silas untied the horse and swung himself up onto the driver's seat. He did not look back at them. He clicked his tongue, and the wagon lurched forward, its wheels cutting deep, parallel wounds in the snow-covered track. The silence in the wagon was heavier than the sky. It was a silence made of fear and suspicion and a desperate, fragile hope. The children huddled together under a coarse wool blanket he had tossed into the back without a word. It smelled of hay and leather and cold air, the scent of the man himself. The landscape unfolded around them, stark and unforgiving. Skeletal trees clawed at the gray clouds. The wind turned mean, whipping across the open spaces with a low, mournful howl. The snow grew thicker, blurring the horizon until the world was nothing but white and the dark shape of the man in front of them. He drove the horse at a steady, unhurried pace. Hours passed. The weak daylight began to fail, bleeding into a deep, velvety dusk. The cold intensified, biting deep into their bones. The youngest boy began to cry, a thin, whimpering sound. The eldest girl pulled him closer, murmuring something too low for Silas to hear. Without turning, Silas reached into a satchel by his feet and pulled out a canteen and a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He passed them back over his shoulder. The girl hesitated for a moment before taking them. Her fingers brushed against his, and she flinched from the unexpected warmth of his skin. Inside the cloth was a chunk of hard bread and a piece of dried meat. It was not much, but it was more than they had seen in days. She broke the bread with methodical care, her cracked fingers trembling slightly. She gave the first, largest piece to the crying boy, then distributed the rest, leaving only a tiny crumb for herself. She unscrewed the canteen and gave each child a sip of the cool, clean water before taking a small swallow herself. She did not eat her piece of bread. She tucked it into a fold of her ragged dress. Silas heard the quiet distribution. He heard the crying stop. He kept his eyes on the path ahead, but he was aware of every small sound, every shift of weight in the wagon behind him. He was a man accustomed to listening to the silence, to reading the language of the unspoken. It was full dark when they finally arrived. A shape emerged from the swirling snow, a low-slung cabin with a single dark window that looked like a blind eye. Smoke curled thinly from a stone chimney, a fragile thread of life in the immense emptiness. A simple barn stood nearby, a dark mass against the white ground. The place felt profoundly alone, as if it had been dropped from the sky and forgotten. He brought the wagon to a halt and swung down. He moved to the back and lowered the tailgate. "We're here," he said, his voice swallowed by the wind. He lifted the sleeping children out one by one, carrying them into the cabin. The eldest girl followed, shepherding the ones who were still awake. The moment she stepped inside, the wind was cut off, and the world became small and close. The cabin was one room. It was sparse, clean, and dominated by a large stone hearth where embers glowed like sleeping cat eyes. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A narrow bed was pushed against the far wall. The air was cool but still, thick with the scent of wood smoke and solitude. It was the house of a man who lived with ghosts. Silas laid the sleeping children on the floor near the hearth. He did not light a lamp. He knelt and began to stoke the fire, adding logs from a neat stack beside the fireplace. The flames caught, licking at the dry wood, and a warm, golden light bloomed in the small space, pushing back the shadows. The light danced on the children's pale, shorn heads. He rose and went to a large wooden chest, pulling out several more blankets, worn but clean. He laid them over the children, tucking them in with an awkward gentleness. Then he took a pot, filled it with water from a bucket by the door, and hung it on the hook over the fire. He added dried vegetables and herbs from tins on a shelf. The smell of cooking, real cooking, began to fill the room. It was a smell so foreign and so welcome it felt like a prayer. The girl stood by the door, a statue carved from ice, watching his every move. He did not speak to her, did not tell her what to do. He simply moved through the familiar rituals of his solitary life, making space for them within it. When the stew was simmering, he took a bowl and a spoon from the shelf and filled it, the steam rising in a fragrant cloud. He walked over to her and held it out. She stared at the bowl, then at his face, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. She did not take it. Her eyes darted to the sleeping children, then back to him. He understood. He nodded, his expression unchanging. He went to the children, woke the oldest of the sleeping ones gently, and gave him the bowl. The boy ate, his eyes closing in exhausted bliss. Silas filled the bowl again and again, moving from child to child until they had all eaten, their small bodies finally uncursing from the day's cold. Only then did he fill a bowl for her. He brought it to the table and set it down. He filled one for himself and sat in the other chair, his back to her. He ate slowly, his gaze on the fire. It was an invitation, not a command. She watched him for a long time. She watched the steady motion of his spoon, the relaxed line of his broad shoulders. He did not look at her. He gave her the dignity of her own choice. Finally, she moved from the door, her bare feet silent on the wooden floorboards. She sat at the table as far from him as she could get, and picked up the spoon. The first taste of hot stew was so overwhelming it brought tears to her eyes. She bowed her head to hide them, her shoulders shaking, and ate. When they were finished, Silas took the bowls, rinsed them and set them aside. He gestured to the remaining space by the hearth. "You can sleep there," he said. "The floor is warm." He went to his own narrow bed but did not get in it. He took the single pillow and one of his own blankets and brought them over, placing them near her. Then he took a chair, moved it beside the cabin's only door, and sat down, leaning his head back against the rough wood. He closed his eyes. He did not lock the door. He became the lock. The days settled into a rhythm, quiet and deliberate as a heartbeat in a sleeping house. Silas rose before the sun. His movements hushed so as not to wake the children scattered like fallen leaves on his hearth. He would tend the fire, milk his single, bony cow, and be gone for hours, checking his trap lines or mending fences at the far edge of his property. The land itself was holding its breath under a thick blanket of snow, and his work was a quiet argument against its stillness. The eldest girl, whose name he still did not know, became the cabin's silent keeper. She woke as he left, the first gray light finding her already moving. She learned the geography of the small room, the particular creak of each floorboard, the way the light fell across the table in the morning. She swept the floor with a handmade broom. She learned to add water to the stew pot that always seemed to be simmering over the fire. She did these things not because she was told, but because work was the only language she knew for earning her keep. The younger children began to thaw. The first few days, they stayed huddled by the fire, their eyes large and watchful. Then, a small boy dared to touch the smooth, carved handle of Silas's knife on the table. A girl discovered a box of old, mismatched buttons and spent a whole afternoon arranging them in patterns on the floor. Their fear began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. They were like seedlings pushing up through frozen earth. One afternoon, Silas returned to find the girl attempting to mend a tear in his coat with a needle and thread she had found in a small sewing box. Her stitches were clumsy, uneven, her fingers stiff with cold and disuse. He stopped in the doorway and watched her, her head bowed in concentration, the firelight catching the fine, pale fuzz that was beginning to grow on her scalp. He felt a strange pang in his chest, a feeling he had buried long ago. He did not comment on her work. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, he sat at the table and sharpened his knife. When he was done, he took a small block of pine wood from the kindling box and began to carve. His large, rough hands moved with surprising delicacy. He worked in silence, the only sound the soft scrape of the blade against the wood. By the time the fire had burned down to embers, he had carved a small, perfect bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. He left it on the mantelpiece and went to his chair by the door. The next morning, the smallest girl found the bird. Her gasp of delight was the first truly joyful sound the cabin had heard in a long time. She clutched it to her chest, her smile a brilliant, fragile thing. The eldest girl looked from the bird to Silas, who was pulling on his boots, his back to her. He did not acknowledge the gift, but a silent understanding passed between them. A week later, she found the courage to step outside. The world was a blinding expanse of white. Near the cabin, under the shelter of a tall pine, was a small, fenced-in plot of land. A simple wooden cross stood at its head, the wood weathered to a soft gray. It was kept clear of snow, a small patch of bare earth in the vast white desert. She stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into her feet, and looked at the solitary grave. It felt like the heart of the place, the source of its deep, quiet sorrow. The next day, while exploring the edge of the woods, she found a single, stubborn winter rose, its petals a pale, waxy pink against the snow. She broke it off carefully and, on her way back to the cabin, she stopped at the grave. With trembling fingers, she pushed the stem into the hard earth at the base of the cross. It was a small, bright wound of color against the gray wood. She did not know she was being watched. Silas stood by the barn, his hand resting on the rough bark of a post, and saw the gesture. He felt it like a hand laid gently on an old bruise. That night, the quiet was broken by a scream. It was one of the middle boys, thrashing in his sleep, his face contorted in a mask of terror. He cried out words that had no meaning, a choked litany of fear. The other children woke, their eyes wide with shared memory. Silas was there in an instant. He did not move from his chair, but his voice cut through the boys' panic, low and steady. "You're safe. It's just a dream. You're here." He did not touch the boy. He just kept speaking, his voice a low, rumbling anchor in the night. The boy's thrashing subsided, his cries turning to ragged sobs, and then, finally, to the quiet breathing of sleep. The eldest girl sat up, her blanket clutched to her chest. The fire had burned low, and the room was filled with deep, moving shadows. She could just make out Silas's silhouette in the chair. "Don't lock us in," she whispered, her voice thin as a thread. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him about the past. He turned his head slightly. "I don't lock doors," he said, and the simple truth of it resonated in the quiet room. He waited a moment, then he asked a question into the darkness. "What's your name?" She was silent for so long he thought she would not answer. "They didn't let us keep them," she finally said. "I'm not them," he replied, his voice gentle. "What was it before?" She hesitated. The name felt like a ghost on her tongue, something that belonged to another girl in another life. "Ilara," she whispered. "Ilara," he repeated, testing the sound of it in the quiet cabin. The fit. And the others. One by one, she gave them to him, whispering the names into the space between them like secrets. Finn, Rose, Samuel, Nell, Pip, Tess, and Leo. He listened to each one, committing them to memory. It was an act of restoration, of giving back what had been stolen. In the dark, silent cabin, surrounded by sleeping children. He had named them, and in naming them, he had claimed them not as property, but as people. When she was done, a new silence fell, but this one was different. It was not empty. It was filled with 8 names, solid and real, stitching their new lives together with raw thread. Alara lay back down, but she did not sleep for a long time. She watched the fire, and for the first time the cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a home. The thaw came not just to the children but to the land itself. The sun grew stronger, and the snow began to retreat, weeping into the thirsty earth. The world, which had been a study in black and white, began to show hints of color. The deep, rich brown of the mud, the pale green of new shoots in the shelter of the woods. The air lost its bite, carrying instead the scent of damp soil and melting ice. With the changing season, the life in the cabin changed too. The children, now confident in their safety, spilled out of the door each morning, their laughter a strange and welcome sound in the vast quiet. Silas carved each of them their own animal, a small wooden menagerie that they treasured. Finn got a wolf, Rose a deer, Pip a fat bear. He even carved a small, rough horse for Alara, which he left on her pillow one morning. She kept it in the pocket of the new dress he had bought for her, its worn fabric a world away from the rags she had arrived in. Her hand would often go to it, her fingers tracing its familiar shape, a secret point of contact with his quiet kindness. From a trip to town, he brought back not just flour and salt, but a bolt of blue calico cloth and a small packet of seeds. He said nothing, simply left the cloth on the table. Alara knew what it was for. She spent evenings by the fire, her head bent, painstakingly cutting and stitching curtains for the single window. When she hung them, the severe little cabin was suddenly softened, the morning light filtering through the blue print, dappling the floorboards. The house, which had been haunted by absence, began to breathe again. Together, they tilled the small plot of land beside the house, turning over the dark, rich soil. Silas showed her how to plant the seeds in straight rows, their hands moving in the dirt, his large and her slender, a silent conversation taking place in the earth. The children helped, their small fingers pressing seeds into the ground with solemn importance. It was an act of faith, a belief in a future that would yield a harvest. Section there were moments of discord, sharp and startling as a dropped dish. One day, Alara tried to bake bread. The loaf she pulled from the hearth oven was a disaster, a hard, blackened lump. She stared at it, her face crumbling with frustration, the first real expression of anger he had seen on her. Silas picked it up, weighed it in his hand. "Well," he said, his mouth twitching at the corners, "that loaf died in vain." Tears of humiliation welled in her eyes. "You didn't complain about mine," he added, gesturing to his own typically dense but edible creations. The dry, understated humor was so unexpected it startled a laugh out of her. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it was a laugh. He smiled, a rare, fleeting expression that transformed his rugged face. In that moment, the distance between them shrank to nothing. One evening, as she stood on the small porch watching the last light bleed from the sky in streaks of blood orange and lavender, he came to stand beside her. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the stars begin to prick the deep indigo canvas. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet. She didn't need to explain the question. Why them? Why her? He stared out at the dark line of the hills. His own ghosts were there, in the deepening shadows. "I had a wife," he said, his voice low, "and a daughter. Fever took them one winter. The house got too quiet." He paused, the silence stretching between them, thick with memory. "The quiet was so loud it hurt. You and the children. You quieted the quiet." She absorbed his words, a truth that settled deep inside her. He hadn't rescued them out of pity. He had rescued them to rescue himself. They were two solitudes, leaning against each other to keep from falling. "You're either the kindest man I've ever met," she said softly, "or the most foolish." He turned his head to look at her, a hint of that rare smile touching his lips. "Can't I be both?" The peace they had built was as fragile as a bird's egg. They knew it, felt it in the vast, watchful silence of the land around them. The past was not a dead thing. It was a sleeping predator, and one day it would wake. The harbinger arrived on a Tuesday, a day that had begun like any other. Silas was mending a harness in the barn, Alara was weeding the new garden, and the children were playing a loud, chaotic game near the creek. The sound came first, the rhythmic beat of shod horses, too many of them, moving at a purposeful clip up the long track to the homestead. Alara straightened, her hand shielding her eyes against the bright sun. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. On the horizon, 3 riders were dark specks against the blue sky, growing larger with each passing second. She called the children, her voice sharp with an urgency they had not heard in months. They came running, their games forgotten, their faces mirroring her fear. They knew, without being told, that the world outside their small sanctuary had finally found them. Silas came out of the barn, the harness leather still in his hand. He saw the riders, and his face settled into a hard, impassive mask. He said nothing, but he put a hand on Finn's shoulder, a small, reassuring pressure. He herded them all towards the cabin. "Go inside," he said to Alara, his voice calm but absolute. "Stay away from the window." She met his gaze, and for a second, she was the girl from the town again, silent and obedient. But then something shifted in her. This was her home. These were her children. She shook her head.
"No."
He saw the new steel in her eyes and did not argue. He only nodded, a flicker of something, pride, perhaps, in his expression. The riders pulled up before the cabin, their horses restless, kicking at the dirt. The man in the middle was a bull of a person, thick-necked and florid-faced in a severe black coat. His eyes were small and greedy. Alara recognized him instantly. Preacher Barnes, the man who ran the workhouse they had fled, a place that scrubbed religion over a core of cruelty and profit. "Silas," Barnes boomed, his voice falsely hearty, "I heard you'd taken in some strays. The Lord's work, some might say. But those strays belong to me. They are wards of my institution. Runaways." Silas stood on the porch, his feet planted, his body a barrier between the riders and the cabin door. He did not raise his voice. "They're not strays, and they don't belong to you." Barnes's folksy demeanor vanished, replaced by a sneer. "They are chattel bound to me by law and contract until they come of age. I have the papers. I've come to collect my property." He spat on the ground near Silas's feet. Behind Silas, inside the cabin, the children were pressed together, silent as mice. Alara could feel their terror, a cold wave emanating from their small bodies. Her own fear was a living thing in her throat, choking her. For a moment, all her newfound strength threatened to desert her. She was just a girl with a shaved head again, helpless against men like this. "They're not property," Silas said again, his voice dropping lower, gaining a dangerous edge. "They're children, and they're staying here." "Are you deaf, man?" Barnes barked, his hand moving to the large pistol holstered at his hip. "I'm not asking." The world seemed to narrow to the space between the two men. The sun beat down. A bird called from the woods, a sound from another, more peaceful world. Silas did not move. He did not reach for a weapon. His stillness was his shield and his sword. He simply stood, immovable, a man defending his own soul. And then the cabin door creaked open. Alara stepped out onto the porch to stand beside him. She was trembling, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides. She looked small and fragile next to Silas's solid frame. Barnes's eyes flickered to her, dismissing her instantly. A foolish girl playing at being brave. "Get back inside, child," Barnes snarled. "This doesn't concern you." "My name is Alara," she said, and her voice, though thin, carried across the yard with shocking clarity. It was the voice of the girl who had named her siblings in the dark. The voice of the girl who had planted a garden. Their names are Finn and Rose and Samuel and Nell and Pip and Tess and Leo. She recited them like a creed. Each name a stone she was laying in a wall. We are not your property. Barnes stared, momentarily thrown off by her defiance. He had expected cowering tears. Not this, not a recitation of names. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. It matters not what you call yourselves. You are mine. He began to dismount, his intent clear. Silas took a half-step forward, placing himself slightly in front of her. His hand was still empty, but every line of his body spoke of a violence he was holding carefully in check. You are not welcome on this land, he said, his voice flat and final. Turn your horse around. Or what? One of the other men taunted, his hand also on his gun. You'll take on all three of us, old man? Just as the tension reached its breaking point, a new sound intruded, a wagon rattling up the track. It was their nearest neighbor, Mr. Henderson, a grizzled old farmer Silas had traded salt for eggs with. He pulled his wagon to a stop a short distance away, his face a mask of grim curiosity. A few minutes later, two more men appeared on foot, drawn from their fields by the sight of Barnes's party. They were the community, the gossips, the watchers, but today their watching felt different. Barnes saw them. He saw their silent, judging eyes. He was a man who operated on the weakness and fear of others, on the assumption that no one would intervene. An audience changed the mathematics of the situation. Public fight was messy. It could damage his reputation, the pious veneer he hid behind. He hesitated, his foot halfway out of the stirrup. In that moment of hesitation, Elara acted. She did not raise a weapon. She did not scream. She stepped past Silas, walked down the single step of the porch, and stopped directly in front of Barnes's horse. She looked up at the big, cruel man, her face pale but resolute. If you want us, she said, her voice shaking but unbroken, you will have to drag us, and they will all see you for what you are. She gestured with her chin toward the silent gallery of neighbors. It was a checkmate. Barnes's power was built on a lie, the lie of his righteousness. To physically assault a young woman and a brood of children in front of witnesses would shatter that lie forever. His face purpled with rage. He was trapped by his own hypocrisy. He stared at her, his little eyes burning with hatred. He saw not a child, but the woman she would become, and he saw a strength there he could not break. With a final, choked curse, he yanked his foot back into the stirrup and wrenched his horse's head around. This isn't over, he spat, his voice thick with venom. Yes, Silas said quietly from the porch. It is. Barnes and his men galloped away, their departure a furious, impotent cloud of dust. The dust lifted behind them like angry ghosts and then settled, leaving the homestead in a profound, ringing silence. Elara stood alone in the yard, her shoulders trembling with the aftermath of her courage. She had not run. She had not hidden. She had stood her ground and named herself. Silas came down from the porch and stopped beside her. He did not touch her. He did not say, I told you so, or that was brave. He just stood with her, a silent, solid presence, until the trembling stopped. He looked over at Henderson, who gave him a slow, deliberate nod of approval before turning his wagon and heading home. The other men melted back into the landscape. That evening, the air in the cabin was different. The threat had been met and vanquished. They had faced the past together and had not broken. As Elara served the stew, her hand brushed Silas's. Neither of them pulled away. It was a small, simple touch, but it held the weight of the entire day. After the children were asleep, they sat by the fire, the silence between them no longer a space to be filled, but a comfort to be shared. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. They had found what was waiting. The passing of a year etched its story onto the land and onto their lives. The raw, angry scar of the confrontation with Barnes faded, leaving behind the hard, clean tissue of certainty. This was their home. They had defended it. They belonged to it and to each other. One crisp autumn afternoon, Silas came back from town with a thin, official-looking document in his coat pocket. He didn't show it to Alara until after supper, when the children were tracing patterns in the frost on the windowpane. He laid it on the table between them. It was a deed of guardianship, legally binding, with all 8 of their names listed beneath his own. His signature was at the bottom, a bold, dark scrawl. Alara traced her own name with her fingertip. Alara. Not child. Not ward. Not property. Alara. The ink on the page seemed to anchor her to the world. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Words were inadequate for what she felt, so she said none. She simply reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. It was a promise, solid and quiet as the mountains on the horizon. The act that truly signified the change was a fire. Not a fire of destruction, but one of cleansing. A few days later, Silas built a small, contained blaze in the yard. He brought out the last of their old things, the threadbare, institutional rags they had arrived in, which Alara had kept packed away in a box as a grim reminder. One by one, they fed the pathetic garments to the flames. They watched the gray cloth blacken, curl, and turn to weightless ash that drifted up into the vast, blue sky. They were burning their ghosts. As the last scrap disappeared, Finn, the oldest boy, looked at Silas and said, with the simple gravity of a child, "Are you our father now?" Silas looked at the circle of small, upturned faces, their hair now grown into soft halos around their heads. He looked at Alara, standing beside him, her hand still loosely held in his. A warmth spread through his chest, chasing out the last of the old, cold quiet. "Yes," he said, "I am." The house was no longer a hollow place. It was full of the scent of baking bread, Alara's bread now, light and perfect, and the sound of Rose humming a tune she'd made up, full of Samuel's endless questions and Tessa's infectious giggles, full of scuffed knees and mended trousers and small, precious secrets. The curtains Alara had made were faded now from the sun, but they made the light inside soft and gentle. The house breathed. Winter came again, circling back as it always did. The first snow fell, thick and silent, blanketing the world in a soft, forgiving white. But this year, the snow was not an enemy. It was just weather. Inside the cabin, a fire roared in the hearth, a bright, cheerful heart against the cold. The wooden animals Silas had carved were lined up on the mantelpiece, a silent, watchful audience. Pip and Nell were asleep in a heap of blankets, their faces slack with childish peace. Finn was reading aloud from an old, worn book, his voice gaining confidence with every page. Leo was on the floor, painstakingly drawing a picture of their house with a piece of charcoal on a scrap of wood. Alara sat in a rocking chair Silas had made for her, mending a sock. The rhythmic push and pull of the needle was a soothing, meditative act. She wore the blue dress, and her hair, now long enough to touch her shoulders, was tied back with a simple ribbon. Silas sat across from her, cleaning his rifle, the firelight gleaming on the polished wood and steel. He looked up and watched her for a moment, his face gentle in the warm light. He saw the quiet strength in her, the fierce love she held for the children, the grace she had found in herself. She felt his gaze and looked up, and a small, soft smile passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible, beautiful life they had built from the ashes of 2 broken pasts. Outside, the snow fell, covering the tracks they had made, burying the old world and making everything new. But inside, by the fire, they were warm. They were named. They were home. This story, it isn't just about rescue. It's about how the most profound acts of salvation often happen in the silence, in the spaces between words. It's about how 2 solitudes, as the poet once said, can protect and touch and greet each other. Silas didn't just save those children from the cold. They saved him from a quiet so deep it had begun to erase him. They filled the empty rooms of his life not just with their voices, but with purpose. And the girl, Alara, she learned that a home is not a place you are given, but a place you claim, a place you defend. Her courage wasn't in a sword or a gun. It was in a name, in speaking her own name and the names of her family into the face of a man who saw them only as numbers on a ledger. That is the moment she became free, not when she was taken from the town, but when she refused to be taken back. So here is the naming. Maybe you have a quiet in your own life that needs filling. Or maybe you are the one standing in the cold, waiting for a hand that doesn't just offer a coin, but offers a place to be safe. We are all, at times, the lonely man in the dusty coat, and at others, the shivering child with no name. The secret is knowing that saving another person is almost always the only way to truly save yourself. And if you're brave enough to kneel in the mud, if you're brave enough to say, "I am here," you might just find that the life you build is warmer and brighter than any you could have imagined. You might just find that you can quiet the quiet after all.